are international signs that the empire is falling. The U.S. wanted a uniform condemnation and sanctions against Russia for invading Ukraine. When Biden called an African summit to get uniform support for condemning Russia, just a little under half of the countries in Africa refused to do that. They abstained from anything like that. 35 nations in the U.S. didn't join the U.S. in condemning Russia for invading Ukraine. And that's because the U.S. is no longer calling all the shots. Our empire is beginning to fall. When the U.S. called for a worldwide boycott of Russian oil and gas, the majority of the world's population, that is, the people in India and the people in China, refused. Instead, they are importing vast amounts of Russian national gas and oil and selling them at a higher price, contributing to the inflation. Only Europe went along with the United States, in spite of many demonstrations by its people. In another sign, the Saudis, who always obediently went along with the U.S., refused to increase oil production. When the U.S. asked that they increase oil production to get prices down, they basically told our government to pound sand, forget it. Even the U.S. oil and gas companies refused our government's request to lower their prices. And of course, the U.S. has its ample supplies of oil and gas. There was no reason to increase the prices except greed, and the U.S. oil and gas companies decided to join the foreign gas and oil companies and raise their prices and refused Biden. That's because they don't have to listen the way they used to. In 1971, then President Nixon called a price freeze because inflation was getting out of control. He called a wage and price freeze, and the penalty for disobeying was immediate imprisonment. The inflation stopped. The corporations listened to the government. The U.S. was at its height. It was capitalist greed that shaped this loss. How does that work? Why did the fall of the American empire have to do with capitalist greed? Well, the U.S. corporations decided in the late 70s that now that technology enabled them to export jobs, now that there were faxes and computers and fast jet travel, they could export their manufacturing to countries with low wages and no ecological protections and pensions and sick days. All those things that unionized American workers fought for, they could evade. China had the most disciplined workforce, and most of those jobs, millions of manufacturing jobs, went to China, whose wages are higher than the others at $3.19 an hour, but nonetheless far short of the over $30 that American workers fought for, and with no protection. So this was an enormous boon for the profits of greedy American companies. They then took the money, the billions they were acquiring, and came back and bought our government, since we have no limits on campaign spending, unlike the rest of Europe, Scandinavia, and other nations. We allowed campaign corporations to buy our government. Also, the U.S., unlike our European counterparts, did not have a strong enough socialist, communist, other left parties. The McCarthy era wiped them out. So they didn't create laws along with the unions, to stop outsourcing. Those penalties exist across Europe and Scandinavia, but not in the United States. So Americans became immiserated. Manufacturing jobs were converted to service jobs, which were the jobs more given to women and therefore lower paid. Unions atrophied. The United States empire is falling. There's every sign. And what the United States is doing to counteract that can be seen in funding the war in Ukraine, because the war in Ukraine, according to Biden's own words, is created to exhaust Russia and to use NATO to exhaust Russia. Russia has the most natural resources in the world. China has the most people. China and Russia are now in an alliance. They are close allies in BRICS, which is an economic rival to the U.S. influence in the economies of the BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, with 12 countries that want to enter BRICS and be part of it. So that one way the United States is trying to regain its dominance is to knock out Russia through the Ukraine, so that we become more dominant, and to use NATO for that purpose, and thus the war in Ukraine, to which the American government, with our passive okay, has allowed $100 billion to be given to that effort. I should say, because it's important to note, that $50 billion would inject every single person in the whole world with enough vaccinations to stop COVID. That's half of what we gave to the war in Ukraine, with Americans' passive acceptance and our Congress going along, with the exception of some very exceptional legislators like AOC. And so, to summarize, the empire is falling, and that affects all of us. It affects our level of danger. It affects our level of safety. It affects our level of belief in government. It affects our health.